This event seeks to explore the potential lessons and consequences of this conflict for the international system and its rule-based framework. We are honored to invite Dr. H.A. Hellyer, a distinguished scholar of international relations with 2 decades of experience across the United States, Europe, and the Middle East. Yang berbahagia Datuk, Professor Dr. Ladies and gentlemen, please allow me first to read the agenda for today. The first agenda item is the opening session, followed by the special lecture event led by our moderator, Professor Ruhanas Harun. Yang berbahagia Datuk, Professor Dr. Ladies and gentlemen, now without further ado, let us now start our program by welcoming the Director of the Institute of Malaysian and International Studies to deliver his opening speech and officiate the program. Please welcome Yang berbahagia Professor Dr. Sufian Jusso.
Bismillahirrahmanirrahim. Assalamualaikum warahmatullahi wabarakatuh. Good afternoon. First, before we start, I would like to invite everyone to say a prayer for Almarhum Ismail Hania. Al-Fatihah. Bismillahirrahmanirrahim. Thank you, Madam Chair, for the kind introduction. I would like to, on behalf of the university, I would like to welcome our special guest today, Dr. Hisham Hellyer, all the way from Europe, and of course, a very distinguished scholar in the area of Palestinian issue. My colleague, Professor Zarina Osman, the President of the Malaysian International Studies Association, Mr. Azril Amin, Chief Executive of the Center of Human Rights Research and Advocacy, Professor Rohanas from UPNM, the moderator, my colleague Dr. Abdul Rahim Ahmad, the head of the West Asian Studies at ICMAS. First of all, I would like to thank Dr. Hisham Hellyer for agreeing to come to UKM. And I had a short conversation with the Vice Chancellor this morning. He welcomed Dr. Hellyer and welcomed everyone here to this very important discussion. We are looking into the role of rules, whether there's any rule whatsoever. So whose rules, why we need a rule is for Dr. Hisham Hellyer to discuss. But of course, we have international rules. We are supposed to have the international order. There's supposed to be a lot of United Nations resolutions, United Nations Security Council resolution, United Nations General Assembly resolutions on this question of Palestinian rights. But most of the time, or all the time that we had a resolution passed in the international organizations, including the United Nations, and the decisions made by the International Court of Justice, they practically fall on deaf ears. Basically, we are hopeless and helpless on how do we impose and implement those resolutions and the decisions of the International Court of Justice. So I don't want to say anything else. I will stop here. I think the best person to discuss this topic is none other than our main speaker today, Dr. Hisham Hellyer. So I welcome him again. Welcome everybody. Thank you so much for coming. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Yang berbahagia Professor Dr. Sufian Jusso, for your kind word. Before we continue with our next agenda, I would like to invite Yang berbahagia Professor Dr. Sufian Jusso, Professor Dr. Zarina Othman, and Mr. Azril Muhammad Amin to be seated at this assigned seat on the right side of this room. All right, okay. Yang berbahagia Datuk, Professor Dr. Ladies and gentlemen, we have finally arrived to our main agenda, the special lecture event session. This session will be conducted by Professor Ruhanas Harun. Allow me to read her short biography. Professor Ruhanas Harun is a professor at the Department of International Relations, Security and Law, National Defence University of Malaysia, UPNM, and a life member of the Malaysian International Studies Association. She was also the director of Center for Defense and International Studies and has held the position of Distinguished Fellow and Lecturers at the Malaysian Armed Forces Staff College, National Resilience College, and National Center for Defense Studies. Professor Ruhanas is a well-known figure on Malaysia's national security and foreign policy and has distinguished herself as a qualified translator, speaks several languages, and has translated books and articles from French into Malay. Current research interests include Malaysia's national security and foreign policy, Malaysia-Indonesia relations, Southeast Asian security issues and international relations, and Russia foreign policy. Yang berbahagia Datuk, ladies and gentlemen, please welcome our moderator on stage, Professor Ruhanas Harun.
Thank you very much, MC. Professor Dr. Sufian Yusuf, Director of ICMAS, Professor Dr. Zarina Osman, Chairperson of the Seminar Organizing Committee and Founding Director of the Malaysian International Studies Association. The acronym is MIISA. Honorable guest speaker, Dr. Hisham Hellyer. I hope I pronounce your name correctly. Excellencies, ladies and gentlemen, welcome to today's forum entitled Future Prospects for Palestine and the Rules-Based Order, Consequences of Israel's War on Gaza. First, let me briefly introduce Professor Hellyer. You have his CV here, but I will just, as a matter of protocol, I'll just read briefly. Professor Hellyer is a renowned scholar specializing in politics, international studies, and religion of the West and in the Arab world. Dr. Hellyer graduated from the University of Sheffield in international political economy and obtained his PhD from the University of Warwick. He's currently he's scholar at the Carnegie Endowment for International Peace and a fellow of the Center for Islamic Studies at the University of Cambridge. He's also a senior associate fellow in international security studies at the Royal United Service Institute in London. Following the London bombing in 2005, Professor Hellyer was appointed as deputy convener of the UK government task force and served as a Foreign and Commonwealth Office Economic and Social Research Council fellow. In 2020, Professor Hellyer was elected as fellow of the Royal Society of Arts as recognition of his expertise in international relations and security. A British citizen of Egyptian and English background, Professor Hellyer is multilingual, fluent in English, Arabic, and French. Professor Hellyer is frequently consulted by the UK, European, and US government agencies, as well as universities to provide views on religion and radicalization. He has widely published in international relations, security, Islamic intellectual thought, religion and modernity, and contemporary Islam. Of course, you have a very, very long list of achievements, but we do not have much time here. And before giving the floor to Professor Hellyer, allow me to provide just a very brief context to the topic of our discussion. Excellencies, ladies and gentlemen, when we planned the discussion on this topic, Little did we know that a sad and shocking event was destined to happen. And that is the unspeakable crime, the assassination of Ismail Haniyeh, the Palestinian leader who passed in Tehran yesterday. As the war raged on in Gaza, and amidst world silence on the destruction and atrocities as a result of the Israeli war in Palestine, and now amidst the shock of this assassination, it is time to honestly consider some basic issues pertaining to the conflict. Let us consider the following. Firstly, why has the world allowed the Palestinian conflict to go on unresolved for so long? Secondly, what emboldened Israel to conduct the war on Gaza? Thirdly, what kind of world order or rules-based order, whatever it is, can tolerate such destructive actions by an external entity on a territory of another state? And finally, is there an alternative to the existing Western-dominated world order, where in this world order, rules are not justly and equally imposed or applied? So to discuss these and more, may I now call upon our distinguished speaker, Professor Hisham Hellyer. Professor, the floor is yours.
Ladies and gentlemen, good afternoon. Professors, honored guests, thank you very much for this kind invitation, and particularly to Professor Rohanas for that kind introduction. It's a great honor to be here at UKM in collaboration with the Institute of Malaysian and International Studies, the Malaysian International Studies Association, MASA, and the Center for Human Rights Research and Advocacy. My thanks to the organizers for their kind invitation to this august event, and to thinking I might have something to contribute by way of addressing all of you. My particular gratitude to Azrul Muhammad Amin from Centra, my collaborator and old friend. Thank you. Before I begin, there was a small story I wanted to start with, just to let you know how pleased I am to be here. I got married in 2007, mid-August. I do know the exact date in case anybody tells my wife that I didn't precisely detail it. And we had moved our wedding up, so we were supposed to be married in September. We ended up doing our nikah in August, and I had to come to Malaysia a week later. So, you know, my wife was very tolerant. She let me get on the plane. I came. This was the very first time I came to Malaysia. It was for an OIC conference that was held in KL right at the end of August 2007. It's my first trip to Malaysia. It was actually my first trip to Nusantara, to Southeast Asia. And I stayed for 4 days. And then I went back. And when I went back, I saw my newly married wife. And I told her, we're going to move to Malaysia. And she looked at me as a tolerant wife would and thought, he's nuts. He just went to Malaysia 4 days and he's become infatuated, and that's never going to happen. And within 11 months, we had moved to Malaysia, where we spent the majority of 2 wonderful years, and then, you know, left thereafter. But I developed a great love for this land, this country, and its people. And I hope to be back again and again and again. So thank you very much again for the invitation and giving me a reason again to be in Kuala Lumpur. A week ago today, a grandson of the British wartime Prime Minister Winston Churchill, stood up in the British House of Lords to offer his comments on the maiden speech of our newly elected government in the UK, which came into office early in July. His name is Nicholas Soames, and he's one of the elder statesmen of the British Conservative Party. He closed his comments with the following. He said, and I quote, "My lords, we are faced with a crossroads, a choice. We can either cast aside selective blindness, recognize and act upon rule of law without fear or favor, however difficult that may be, or we can continue in determined blindness. But if we do that latter, we must know that we are jettisoning an order that was hard won, and we cannot be therefore surprised when other world actors replace it, and we cannot be surprised at the consequences that follow." End quote. It was a very telling comment, and one that struck me for not only its succinctness, but also for the very stark message that it gave. And as I said, Lord Soames is a very elder Conservative Party statesman. So one might have thought that he was talking about Russia's invasion of Ukraine, and certainly such comments would definitely apply in that regard. But he wasn't. He was talking not about an enemy of the West, he was talking about an ally of the West. Lord Soames continued to say, and I quote, "This is the kind of lawless behavior we might expect from a rogue state, an enemy of the West and an enemy of a rules-based order. But let me remind my noble lords that this is a first world state, a proclaimed key ally of the UK, the US, and the West. My lords, if the West is to maintain any hold or credibility in upholding the rules-based order on which we all depend, rule of law must apply to all equally. And if it does not, it is not rule of law at all." End quote. I suspect we are now all familiar with what state Lord Soames was referring to. He was referring to the state of Israel. And Lord Soames was taking the opportunity to raise this particularly important point around the rules-based order in the aftermath of the advisory opinion that was offered by the International Court of Justice earlier in July, which made clear that the international community and international law recognized that the Palestinian territories were illegally occupied by Israel and the occupation must end. And actually, the advisory opinion went into quite a lot of detail about the occupation, about how states should engage with the occupation, what measures are required, and so on. And I should point out, because it was an advisory opinion, and that's for a procedural reason that we call it an advisory opinion, because the opinion was requested not by a state, but by another body of the UN. And because it's requested by another body of the UN, it's an advisory opinion, but make no mistake, that is the stance in international law. And it was an important statement, of course. But on one level, it wasn't and isn't the International Court of Justice's statements or opinions or verdicts and its moves that I found most startling. And of course, there have been many startling ones over the past 12 months, including South Africa's case of genocide. Rather, it was the response of different parts of the international community to the ICJ and also to the ICC, to the International Criminal Court's moves over the last 10 months in particular. And I will say that fortunately, the overwhelming majority of the world's states came out not critical of the ICJ or the ICC and respected the integrity of both courts. And you can see this very clearly outlined at the UN in terms of different votes and statements from various states. But there was a portion of the international community, particularly in the West, and I have to say by particular countries in the West, not the West in general. You can't say this about Ireland or Slovenia or Spain or Belgium or indeed even the EU foreign policy chief, Josep Borrell, but I'll go into that later on. But it was a particular portion of international opinion that I wanted to delve into. And it probably won't surprise you that somebody who works as much as I do in Washington, D.C. is going to talk about the United States. There was a book that was recently published by Politico's national security reporter, Alexander Ward. He calls it The Internationalists. And the subject of it includes one of my former colleagues at the Carnegie Endowment for International Peace, Jake Sullivan, who became US President Joe Biden's national security advisor when the latter became president. The book's basic aim was to, and I quote, write a story of a team that came in with immense confidence, lost it during the withdrawal of Afghanistan, and found their mojo again with the defense of Ukraine, end quote. Sullivan, but also others from quote unquote Team Biden in the foreign policy, national security arena in the United States are portrayed as, and he says, a group of sober-minded yet idealistic professionals who took office intending to end wars and to repair America's ailing body politic at home and its damaged reputation abroad in the wake of Donald Trump. Very prescient words. I found that very striking because since October last year, these internationalists who advocated the rules-based order when it came to Russia and Ukraine, following the former's invasion of the latter, who lauded international law and its institutions, who praised the ICC for its arrest warrant of Vladimir Putin, who desired so much for America's reputation abroad to be repaired following Donald Trump. They have presided over one of the greatest acts of sabotage when it comes to the rules-based order and managed the degradation of America's reputation that will last for years, if not decades, to come. Because let us be clear, if the rules-based order is important, then international law must be upheld. And if it must be upheld by one, against one, it must be held by all, against all. But if the strongest advocate of that order not only fails to uphold international law, simply because the accused is an ally, but actually excuses the complete and total dismissal of international law, then the credibility of the system itself is irrevocably damaged. Consider this latest editorial by the Financial Times in London. And the Financial Times is not known for being a bastion of radical left-wing activist circles. The opinion leader, not an opinion piece, but the leader of the Financial Times wrote, "None of the International Court of Justice's advisory opinion should come as a shock. The UK, the EU, and much of the rest of the world long deemed Israeli settlements as illegal, while the US considers them illegitimate. Yet the West has treated Israel with kid gloves, essentially giving it a free pass as it violates international law. Such inaction feeds perceptions of Western hypocrisy and undermines the notion of a just, rules-based order." The end quote. The High Representative for the European Union, Josep Borrell, he went further and he said, "We will have to choose between our support to the international institutions and the rule of law and our support for Israel." And both things are going to be quite difficult to make compatible. Burrell was right, but actually I think he understated the issue, in my opinion. We all have to choose between our support to international legal institutions or our support for our friends, because there will be times when trying to do both will be incompatible. As someone heavily engaged in foreign policy discussions in London and Washington, but also in the Arab world, the situation for the rules-based order was already in a very dire strait and situation before the events of October 7 last year. And now it's many times worse. As someone indeed, the Jordanian Foreign Minister Ayman Safadi said on the 22nd of July, Gaza has not only become a graveyard for children, it has become a graveyard for international law, a shameful stain on the whole international order. It's a damning indictment, but it's not one that we can ignore. Over the past 6 months, from my vantage point as a policy analyst at a Washington, D.C. think tank and at a London one, I cannot remember another time in my lifetime where the breaking of international law was not just ignored by Washington, but was actively defended, excused, and dismissed repeatedly. Now, I want to be very clear here. The United States is not the only perpetrator in this regard. There are quite a number of countries, including in the Middle East, besides Israel, that I could name, but we're focusing on this topic right now. And it makes a difference when it is the United States, though, because it's the United States that makes, how shall I say, it builds its case internationally for defending the rules-based order. So when it is the one that ignores it or sabotages it, it makes a big difference. They're not the only ones, though. But maybe we'll talk about that later. The International Criminal Court in DC is not only dismissed, but it's actually actively attacked by American officials. The Republican Party now has a vice presidential nominee who called on the US Department of Justice to investigate the prosecutor general for, and I quote, supporting terrorism, because he's seeking a warrant for Israeli officials. When it comes to institutions like the United Nations Security Council and the ICJ, the situation is not that much better. When it comes to the ICC, Washington doesn't recognize the authority of the ICC. It does recognize the authority in theory of the UN Security Council and the ICJ. But over this particular issue, the Biden administration is on the record as saying that a UN Security Council resolution was non-binding. By point of fact, there's no such thing as a non-binding UN Security Council resolution. If it's inoperable, that's one thing, but not non-binding. That the ICJ's ruling on the occupation was also advisory. Yes, it was advisory for the reasons that I pointed out. It's a procedural issue. It's not because it doesn't speak to the case in international law. It doesn't distract from that position. And it rejected South Africa's case claiming genocide before the case was even heard. When the US in particular dismisses all of this out hand, as I said, it's not the only one that breaks international law. There are many other countries that we could talk about. But when it does it, it makes clear to the rest of the world the strongest advocate of the rules-based order does not actually support the rules-based order, that there aren't actually rules and it isn't actually orderly. Rather, there are rules for some and they are meant to benefit our allies, penalize our enemies, or at the very least, our allies are exempt from the consequences. So these are therefore not rules, they're just hobbies. Ladies and gentlemen, I don't take any pleasure in pointing all of this out because none of this is a game. I think this is actually very dangerous. A noted European politician, Donald Tusk, the Prime Minister of Poland, he said a few months ago, I know it sounds devastating, especially to people of the younger generation, but we have to mentally get used to the arrival of a new era, the pre-war era. I don't exaggerate. This is becoming more and more apparent every day. Now, Donald Tusk is obviously talking about Russia. And by the way, and its moves in Europe, and I don't think that he's far off the point when it comes to this at all. But Russia is not the only crisis on the horizon. The climate crisis is upon us. There will be other crises that will come upon us, crises that we don't know anything about yet. We're in the midst of several right now, but there will be more. And the rules-based order is not optional in terms of addressing crises. Rather, if it goes, something else is going to have to take its place. And that's the question that I wish to pose, which I hope we will consider together, and perhaps there'll be questions that will bring some of this out as well. If this is indeed the nature of the current rules-based order, i.e. the rules are that malleable, are we seeing the beginning of an intense and continual decline and fragmentation of international order? And if so, what are we to do about it? Whether those of us in quote unquote the first world, I wish I had a better expression than that, and those in the global south. Again, I wish I had a better expression than that. Because the current system of international law, I'm happy to say, is supported by the vast majority of the world states. You know, as I noted, the institution of the ICJ, the institution of the ICC, these institutions are supported worldwide. You know, just to pick recognition of the state of Palestine as an indicator, I think it's about 148 countries out of 178 countries worldwide that recognize the state of Palestine, for example. And I'm not getting into whether or not, you know, one state, two state, you know, that's not my point. My point is that the institutions of international law, respect for international law, I think is, if you're talking about public opinion, I think the situation is quite good. But in terms of power politics, law is affected as a result of will, and will has to have some sort of enforcement mechanism, and there isn't one that is independently enforceable without the political commitment of powerful states. And let us be frank, this is the reason why, even if Israel is found guilty of the charge of genocide, it's not going to listen to the ICJ, right? It's already ignored quite a few things from the ICJ and the ICC and the UN multiple times over the decades. But I still think it's an important case. But beyond that, if Donald Trump becomes president for a second time in the United States, which is still, you know, a very strong possibility, then support, I think, for international multilateral institutions will also drop. And you have to keep in mind, the United States funds a lot of those institutions. So people can claim that they'll just move on. Well, they won't just move on by default, okay? Because a lot of these institutions depend on American financial support. And even if Kamala Harris becomes president, given what we have already noted over the last 10 months, there's not much room to expect a remarkable change in how Washington, D.C. operates. And in rooms like these, I really hope we can all consider carefully how to prepare for a world that has a second Trump presidency, but also how to prepare more medium and long term for a world that by default, I'm not saying that this is what's going to happen, by default is headed towards more, not less, chaos. On the other hand, if such issues are taken seriously, if we look at what has happened in Gaza, if we look at what has happened in Sudan, if we look at what has happened in Syria at the hands of the Bashar al-Assad regime, if we look at the invasion of Ukraine by Russia, and I could go on with a long litany of different issues that have come up just simply during my lifetime. If we look at all these things and we realize that this tells us that injustice can be carried out without penalty, accountability, and impunity, that maybe we ought to find a way to build for the next phase. One where enough of the world lays claim to perhaps a new rules-based order truly underpinned by law. One where partnership governed by mutual respect and collective legal responsibility is the bedrock, where smaller nations and larger nations are seen as partners rather than one being set to exploit or invade the other, or where tyranny reigns. But ladies and gentlemen, we should not be naive. A new phase is coming, whether we like it or not, and we owe it to our citizens, our children, and forthcoming generations to prepare ourselves and them for the rigors of what is to come. With that, I thank you for this kind invitation again. As I said, it's always a pleasure to be in Malaysia, and I hope to be here again and again and again. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Professor Hellyer. Before I open the floor for discussion, I'd like just to point out a few main points brought out by Professor Hellyer. Very interestingly, you brought out this quotation about the selected blindness versus perpetual or permanent blindness. I think for that one, no doctor can repair, actually. So now this blindness actually led to the world, in a way, accepting the kind of lawless behavior that you mentioned just now. And I'm referring to Israel, because this is our topic for today. Now, in this context, how can we apply the law equally among states with regards to Palestine? How can Israel be made to obey at least, some laws? How can nations persuade Israel to obey international rules and norms? And you also mentioned that sober-minded advisors in the American presidential office wanted to repair the so-called American image in the world following Trump's policy. But the question is, has it been able to do so? And you said that it has failed. So when we find that, and you also mentioned that not only the United States has failed to repair its image, it has also become, well, accessory, that's my word. I think we changed the word accessory to the main flag carrier to Western hypocrisy, which you mentioned just now. And you also mentioned that Gaza has become the graveyard of international law. And that you also remind us that it's not only the United States that is guilty, but also countries in the Middle East. And I would add some Arab countries whose name we shall not mention here, because we're not here for that. And that rules are malleable. And because of that, I put the same question as you did. Are we seeing the beginning of the end of the international order, or the rules-based international order? So if that is the opinion or the conclusion that we come to, so I think we can discuss some of these questions arising out of Professor Hellyer's talk. And now our preference is for questions coming from the audience here in this room, because I've been told that there are also people online. Oh, I see. But I want to say that preference would be given to you all in this room. And I'd like to remind you just on several points. Number one, state your name and institutions you belong to, and that your questions should be brief, to the point, and pertaining to the topic today. So with that, can we have a show of hands? Sorry. Oh, did I ask you a question? Okay, Professor, yes.
Speaker's prerogative. Because you mentioned a very good point. I've been asked multiple times over the past 9-10 months, what can be done? And you see in media coverage and pundits and whatnot, Israel is withstanding American pressure. And Israel is ignoring American pressure. And that the Americans are putting more and more pressure. And I find this quite laughable, to be honest, because the reality is several things can be true at once. Biden does not like Benjamin Netanyahu. It's very well established. He really dislikes this man. He would love to see him leave office. That does not mean that he has used the leverage that exists in American hands with regards to the state of Israel. And there is tremendous leverage in American hands when it comes to the state of Israel. And when we talk about leverage, I'm talking about the United States having a permanent seat on the UN Security Council, where it vetoes quite regularly resolutions that pertain to Israel, that the United States arms the state of Israel to the tune of billions of dollars every year. There's actually extensive networks of support. So it's not a neutral space, right? They do not touch this sort of thing. There was one tiny thing that took place over the last few months where one type of bomb, literally one type of bomb, it was a 3,000-pound bomb, was withheld from Israel by the United States for, I think, 3 months. Apart from that, there is all of that support. So when we talk about pressure, rhetorical pressure doesn't really mean very much, especially if the person or the party on the other end of the line is quite secure in thinking that accountability will not be upheld. They have a sense of impunity because it's real. It is impunity. So I think that that's important. The point about hypocrisy is well spoken, because I did bring this up. I will say, not because you disagreed or because you said otherwise, but just for the sake of clarity, there are many in the international community that are very guilty of hypocrisy. And I do find it highly amusing to see certain states at the UN calling out Western hypocrisy over, for example, invasion and occupation, when they have been doing it for quite a long time. And I won't go into too many states because, well, I'm already probably banned from a lot of places as it is. The final thing, which is about the end of the international sort of order. Again, these things happen by default, not because of planning, right? And I think that if we just let things sort of move in this sort of way, I don't think that it means that the international order disappears. I think that probably certain bits and pieces of it would stay afloat, but the system itself would become very fragmented. But again, this is if you just let it go, if you just allow it to sort of float away. And that's a choice, it's a choice of omission as opposed to commission. And I think people should take another choice, one where they actually actively look for ways to do something better. Thank you so much.
Thank you. Yes, Colonel Sulaiman.
I'm Colonel Suleiman from the Federal Republic of Nigeria, currently attending course National Resilience College. Thank you so much, Doctor, for your insightful discussion. Following the assassination of Ismail Haniyeh, several reactions from across the globe have continued to pour in. For example, China, France, and Russia have actually expressed deep concerns over the current ceasefire efforts. So I wanted to know your view on how this assassination is going to affect the ceasefire efforts. And then secondly, for how long is the international community going to wait for the two-state solution? Your view on that?
Do you want to take one by one, or should we take several?
I'll take one by one.
Okay. Moderator's privilege. So thank you very much. I thought you were Malaysian. So the ceasefire efforts. So, you know, one of the best places for finding information about Israel and Israeli politics in a really honest fashion is actually the Israeli media. Particularly, not always, but particularly Haaretz. Okay, Haaretz is, Haaretz has gone a little bit down over the years, but it's still a really good source of information and much better than a lot of outlets that you would find in the United States or Europe. Highly critical. I mean, just as a sort of side note, you know, a room that looks a little bit like this, but is perhaps a little bit bigger, is Congress. And when Netanyahu went to Congress last week, he got a rousing applause from, you know, mostly Republicans, but also quite a few Democrats. Of course, there were many people that weren't part of Congress, and half of the Democrats didn't show up to his arrival. But it struck me he would never get that reception in the Knesset in Israel itself. Actually, it would never happen. It hasn't happened in a very, very long time. And the Israeli press published a long piece about, I think it was about 2-3 weeks ago, where it detailed over the past 10 months, the number of times and how Benjamin Netanyahu has sabotaged ceasefire negotiations. Every time something happens, to the point where other parts of the Israeli negotiation team leak to the press that they fully expect him to do something, but they're going to try anyway. Okay, it gets to that point of absurdity. And people wonder why. And the reality is that before October 7th, Benjamin Netanyahu was already an unpopular prime minister. And October 7th was an intelligence failure of the highest degree. When this is all said and done, at least for the Israelis, there will be a national inquiry into October 7th, in the same way that there was a national inquiry in 1973 due to the October War, which took the Israelis, well, I say it took them by surprise. Actually, some of the establishment knew that an attack was coming, and they tried to get the other parts of the establishment to prepare, and they refused. So Golda Meir actually faced, she was the Israeli prime minister at the time, she faced a national inquiry thereafter, and it was really biting. This is much worse. Okay, so he's going to have to face that. There are already law cases, there are already legal cases that are lodged against him for things that have nothing to do with October 7th. He's going to have to face that. So I want us all to just keep in mind the end of the war, at least under these conditions, and I call it a war, even though it's not, you know, it's hard to call the unilateral bombardment of Gaza a war, but for the sake of just this particular discussion, the end of it is really bad news for Netanyahu. And personally, I've become convinced that he will not allow this to end until he's sure that he's going to be able to package himself as having one as being the savior of Israel, so that again, when elections take place, he wins. Because the alternative is that he loses, and he could go to jail for a whole bunch of different things. And as I said, there were a number of court cases that were lodged against him. So it is. Some people think that the assassination was an act of desperation. I don't believe that. I think actually it was very calculated. It was very targeted. I think it was very I mean, there was one thing that perhaps was also intended to be sent as a message, because remember, Hania was in Tehran, and he had just met the Iranian president the day before. So I think it was also sent as a message to, quote unquote, the axis of resistance. And I use this completely in quotation marks with all due respect, because I also remember Syria. I think this was sent as a message. We will get you wherever we want, and you will not be protected. And we have the power to do this, even on your home turf, the day after. I mean, so this is the other thing. The Israelis keep on talking about collateral damage, and they've killed tens of thousands of people in Gaza as a result of, quote unquote, collateral damage. They know how to pinpoint, and actually they, quote unquote, pinpointed in this assassination attempt. So they have the technology to do this. It is also a choice, right? So I think that was also a message. It was a message to Tehran. It was a message to Hezbollah. It was a message to Hamas. But I think fundamentally, it was about scuttling the ceasefire negotiations. And I don't think that Netanyahu will ever allow these negotiations to be successful unless pressure, and I mean real pressure, actual leverage, is used by the United States to force it into a change of behavior. That's my personal opinion. In terms of how long will the world wait for a two-state solution? So again, it's not the world, right? I mean, this is also something else that I feel we need to be very clear about. I understand why you say that. I know it feels like that because the power dynamics are pretty skewed, right? But as I said, it's not even a majority. It's like the vast, vast majority of the member states of the United Nations have been very clear on recognizing a Palestinian state. And they have recognized a Palestinian state. And actually, even in Europe at the moment, a majority of European states, not a majority of the EU, but a majority of European states have recognized the state of Palestine. So it's not about the world as much as it's about a very small number, but very powerful states that refuse to do so. And, I think this is also why the ICJ advisory ruling was so important, because, the attack in the Golan Heights, I'm sorry, moderator, but the attack in the Golan Heights last week, the number of times that I saw this reported as an attack on Israel, it's like, the Golan Heights is Syrian. It's not Israeli. More than that, the 12 children who died were not Israelis. They were Syrians. Actually, CNN's own national security correspondent, he reported, I think he was on the ground there, he reported none of these children had Israeli citizenship because the Druze of the occupied Golan Heights refused to take on Israeli citizenship. The Golan Heights was occupied in 1967, and the entirety of the world does not recognize Israeli sovereignty there, except, unfortunately, two states. Israel, which annexed it in, I think, 1981. And just during the Trump administration, the United States. But the Biden administration has accepted that designation. So the recognition of a state, which is completely grounded in international law, would then raise the uncomfortable question of, well, what do you do about all of the obstacles to the establishment of that state, i.e. all of these settlements that have turned the West Bank into Swiss cheese? And that doesn't make people very comfortable. So again, but I really want people, because I fall into this a lot, okay? Because certainly in the majority of the circles that I go into, they haven't recognized the Palestinian state. But you know, the United States, the UK, and a few countries, and quite a few countries in Europe, they're not the world. They're not the international community. And I say this as a Brit. I'm very happy to be a Brit. I have no qualms about that. But the world is not these tiny policy arenas. And we have to stop thinking like they are and push them and encourage them to recognize, as I tried to do in my talk, that international law is there for all of us. And if it falls, then it's bad for all of us. Thank you.
All right. We'll take 2 questions this time. Yes. Yes. Gentleman in red.
Bismillahirrahmanirrahim. Assalamualaikum and a very good afternoon to our honorable speaker, Professor Hellyer. My name is Aizat from Faculty of Social Sciences and Humanities, University of Malaysia, UKM. And my question is, if you could share with us, what can Malaysia and other countries in the world can do to force the Israel to follow the rule-based order, or perhaps, or in other way, to at least to persuade the Israeli citizenship people to force their government to follow the rule-based order in terms of to push the peace process in this conflict. Thank you.
All right. One more. Yes. Yes.
Assalamu alaikum. My name is Muhammad Yahya from Faculty of Law, UKM. For me, I just want to say a few things here. We are really concerned about what is happening in Gaza, and we are more concerned because the victims are Muslims. And we are Muslims, and the blood of a Muslim is sacred. This is what we know within our religion. And our religion is a priority. For the past 20 years, we have witnessed the attack of and destruction of Muslim countries by the West. And mostly we keep quiet. And this has been ongoing for a long time. And most of the Muslim countries, their leaders are not representing neither Islam, neither the Muslim there. And we as young Muslims, protesting against our government also is not the best option. So what should be?
I apologize, but is there a question that you'd like me to address?
Yeah, my question here is, what should be the way forward for the Muslims in these particular situations here?
Okay, thank you very much. Actually, your question is not so different, I suppose, from the previous one, in that, you know, what is the way forward? I'll say one thing in response directly to you. I don't know if you want to be framing this as a problem that Muslims have to address, because I think that actually this goes beyond, first, the Muslim community. Second, if it's going to be successful, that you have to form alliances on the basis of the common good. Okay. And if you put, you know, it was really interesting. I saw a report earlier today as I was coming into KL by, he's the director of a think tank. I don't know if it's in Kuala Lumpur. I didn't check, but I think it said the Asia Middle East Policy Institute or something. And he's Palestinian, and he said that looking at Gaza or Palestine as quote unquote a Muslim issue is a really bad idea. That it's a human issue and that it should be regarded as such, partly because many Palestinians are not Muslim, but also because this is an issue that should concern anybody of just basic human decency, right? And when you make it a Muslim issue, then you're basically telling non-Muslims, you know what, we don't need you. Your voice is not wanted here, it's not relevant, and that's not the case, and nor is your help required or requested. And that's just simply not the case. I know you didn't mean anything about that. Okay, I know you were asking, but I think it's important for us to try to frame these things in a particular way. I also want to say, to our detriment, we focus on certain issues more than we do others, and we forget about others. So, for example, and I think I've made very clear my stance on Palestine. I don't know how many people talk about Sudan. I don't know how many people in Malaysia, or for that matter, the West, or for that matter, anywhere in the world, really know much about what's going on in Sudan. Sudan is a catastrophe, an absolute catastrophe. And I wish I saw even half of the attention that we give to Palestine, to Sudan. Because, alhamdulillah, our hearts are big, right? It's not, well, if I take from that, then I'm going to have less here. No, alhamdulillah, people's hearts just expand, right? And I think this is important. I don't see much talk about the Uyghurs. And they've been facing a really difficult time. Where's the attention there? Or the Rohingya? Or, right? We could go on about different things, not just right now, but over the years. People have forgotten about many other conflicts. And I don't know all of them myself. I'm just thinking about the ones that I know, that I study. Okay. And I think that that's also, quite important to think about, different regimes in the Arab world. I'm thinking particularly about Bashar al-Assad because I focused on that conflict for a long time, and that was disgraceful. But I don't see much focus on that now. But we also have to be very aware that justice is justice. It's not the cause célèbre, as they say. Oh, by the way, and I meant to do this earlier. I wish I was fluent in French. I would embarrass myself if I tried to speak French for more than 10 seconds. Un peu. But indeed, I took it for 6 years, and my mother was Francophone. Allah yarhamha, she'd be really ashamed. But I think that we do have to be very clear that justice is justice, irrespective of anything else, and irrespective of who is the one who's doing the pressure. So thank you. I appreciate that. There was a question. Yeah. Well, actually, that was the first question. This is the second question. What can Malaysia do? Okay, so I'm not advocating any change in policy by Malaysia, but you don't recognize the state of Israel, so there's nothing that you can do with regards to Israel because you have no relations with them in the first place. By the way, even if you did, there probably wouldn't be very much that you could do either. This is the same situation that very many states are in the position of right now because, frankly, Israel doesn't listen. Again, it does listen to the United States, and it does listen to the United States if the United States puts muscle behind what it says. So what personally I suggest to people is that if they are unhappy with the state of Israel, with the policies vis-a-vis the state of Israel, that they should lobby their own governments to lobby the United States, because really, the US is extremely isolated on the world stage when it comes to this particular issue. It really is, and it knows it, okay? It knows that its international reputation has plummeted. I'll tell you that even my own country's reputation has taken a hit over the past 10 months as a result of our own policy when it came to this, although I think it's recovered, some of it over the past few weeks, but the US's standing internationally has really gone down. Okay, so I think that I do think the US does respond to that sort of engagement, but it's very indirect because again, with the amount of support that the US gives to Israel, it doesn't actually care about the criticism, about the attacks that it gets from other quarters, as much as it would, I think, if the US put genuine pressure on it as opposed to rhetorical ones. I hope that makes sense. And again, I appreciate your questions. Thank you.
One last question. Oh my God, why there's so many hands?
Can you just stand up and speak?
Okay.
Can you use the microphone?
Yeah. So there are 3 hands. 1, 2. Okay. Just say one after. All right. Please.
Right. Hello.
Very brief.
Right. Hello, my name is Siti Khadija from USIM, student of law. So I actually have 2 questions, but I'll keep it brief. Firstly, is on the extension of the assassination. Is it possible, or are there chances that it would escalate into a broader regional conflict? And will that affect smaller regions like the Southeast Asia on issues of security, economy, and political alliances? So the second question is about the pressure against Israel. So we understand that it's the backing of certain very powerful countries that have global influence. Then is it possible for BRICS to break that and actually shift the power that the US has? And will that be a step forward to remedying the genocide in Gaza?
Thank you.
Good evening, everyone. My name is Rahul. I'm not associated with any organization. I just got the link from your social, Dr. Hisham, so I'm here. My question actually echoes...
So what's your name?
Rahul.
Rahul.
Yes, hi. My question actually echoes literally what she said, but it's on a different level with regards to yesterday's assassination. I just want to know, how would you draw parallel to what happened with Obama when he went in and took out bin Laden? I believe it's a sovereign state, Pakistan, and they went in deliberately, took him down. And in your historical, in your knowledge, what would you draw parallels with yesterday and what happened with that situation? And secondly, literally what the sister just said is, could we not shift this whole American-dominated, as and when they choose to exert power or break it, to a country which probably can challenge them on the global stage, something like China maybe? Thank you.
Okay, thank you. And I appreciate the different questions and that they were kept succinct. So will the assassination lead us to a regional conflict? So where is the lady in question? Okay. We're already in a regional conflict. You know, somebody pointed this out to me recently. It's like, you know, you're afraid of something we're already in. So there is already a regional conflict, but of course it can get much worse. And what I'm quite sure of is that neither Iran, and I'm not here to speak on behalf of the state of Iran, you have a representative here, but this is my reading of it. I don't think Iran wants a wider regional confrontation that goes beyond a certain threshold. Proxies, yes. Some missiles here, yes. All-out war, you know, like, I don't know, like a repeat of 1973, for example, okay? No, I don't think that's what they want. I think that they have been very calculated, insofar as somebody can be calculated, and I'll say one word about that afterwards, about not going for that. I think that's also true of Hezbollah, and I think that's also true of the Israelis, that nobody at present wants that, you know, massive confrontation, because everybody loses, okay? It would be devastating for, well, all of those actors, but also more generally in the region. Now, having said that, the point about calculation. If I had a ball and I wanted to roll that ball down this hall to that step over there, and I look in front of me, there's nothing here, right? Can you see there's nothing here? No, but I can, right? Because I've got full view of the factors and so, you know, so I'm gonna send it down, and it'll probably go in the direction that I want. Well, what if the lights are off? And what if there are people there? And what if there are holes? And what if actually I throw the ball, but actually I hit somebody else? And so on and so on. That's what, quote unquote, calculated escalation is all about. All right. You can't do calculated escalation. It's a complete oxymoron. When you send a missile or 20 or 5 or whatever, assuming that, you know, 5 or 10 will not hit its target, okay, you have no idea if that's actually going to be the case. You don't have control over all the factors. So I'm sure that Iran and Hezbollah will respond to the assassination and also to the killing of the Hezbollah leader in southern Beirut. And I'm sure that they will try to do so in a way where the response is the last, you know, step in that particular cycle. You know, in the same way that the Israelis claimed that the killing of the Hezbollah leader in southern Beirut was, quote unquote, the last step in that particular cycle. you have no idea, right? You have absolutely no idea. And by the way, I'm not, well, I won't talk about Majd al-Shams right now, but I'm not actually sure that Hezbollah meant to do that in the first place. So this idea about controlled escalation so that we don't head into this big, massive conflict that you're concerned about, it's really quite silly to assume that you have control over those variables, that you know all the variables, that you know all the factors. It's incredibly risky and very, very reckless, which is why, you know, I say the default is escalation. So we have to actively push for de-escalation, because escalation only means more destruction and devastation for everybody. Okay. If God forbid there's quote unquote an all-out conflict between Lebanon and Israel, the destruction upon everybody in the region is huge. Okay, and you can't just assume, but by default everybody's going to get along. No, it will be active. It will have to be as a result of an active engagement. What sort of effect that would have on Southeast Asia? Oh, heck if I know. You know, and again, this is the whole point. We don't know all the factors. We don't know all the variables. You know, just a little bit over a year ago, poor guy, Jake Sullivan stood up on a podium like this, and he said, "The Middle East has never been so quiet." A couple of weeks later, October 7th. Okay, so we don't know what the repercussions could be. We don't know what could take place in a week from now and a month from now. I just hope and pray that we find ways to reduce and de-escalate, because again, the cost to ordinary people would be massive otherwise. BRICS. You know, I'm not so sure about BRICS. I'm not opposed to BRICS, but I'm not sure that let me put it this way. I think a lot of people put a lot of weight on BRICS that BRICS itself doesn't actually ask for. BRICS is a forum. I'm not sure that it's one that is meant to quote unquote replace anything. And it was interesting. I was just with the South African foreign minister, former foreign minister, Naledi Pandor, for several days. And people, she's no longer foreign minister, but people brought up BRICS, and I'm paraphrasing here. It'll be out there on the web somewhere what she actually said verbatim. But she said something like, "If you think that BRICS is a place for you to go and like bash other powers, it's the wrong forum for you. It's about development. It's about cooperation." So, I'm not sure that it's meant to be quote unquote that alternative. And if it was, I don't know if it would work, to be honest, not at the moment. But that's just my take on it, and I could very easily be wrong, as I'm sure wrong about many things. I have to admit I was stumped by your question, Rahul, because I don't know what sort of parallels I would draw between. I mean, obviously they're extrajudicial, so that's a parallel, but very different figures. So I'm not really sure what the. So, for example, Hania had an arrest warrant. Oh, well, there was no arrest warrant. There was going to be an arrest warrant, presumably at the ICC. So any suspicions around him should have been fulfilled by that. I don't think there was any arrest warrant for bin Laden, for example. I mean, I don't know how there are parallels. Hamas is not Al-Qaeda. So I mean, I know you weren't saying that. So what were you getting at?
No, I just want to clarify. I'm not referring to the gentlemen who were assassinated. I'm referring to the fact that in one state is the United States that actually went in unauthorized into a sovereign state and took him out.
Yes.
And in this case, obviously, we assume it's Israel.
I mean, it's not the first time the U.S. does that, to be fair. I mean, the U.S. very often in its history has gone into states.
Yeah, but then Obama also is known categorically for doing more drone attacks than anybody else. So I'm just asking with regards to the rule of law. So, I mean,
well, it's illegal,
rules-based.
But I'm sorry, I get the impression that there was some sort of point that you were trying to draw out here, and I'm not getting it.
It was echoing when you mentioned about the United States not supporting and not following and going as they wish, at times supporting, at times not supporting. So I was just wondering if there's anything that would actually sort of draw a parallel between the two situations, one about 8-10 years ago and an 8-year stint off of Obama's presidency versus what's happening right now with Biden, who was Obama's at that time, VP and...
Yeah, but well, for one thing, the assassination in Iran wasn't an American operation. They deny, by the way, they knew anything about it, which I wouldn't be surprised about, to be perfectly honest with you. But it could have been that they knew. But Blinken flat out denied that yesterday when he was it yesterday? Yeah, and yesterday when he was in Singapore, actually. But yeah, I see now what the point that you were making. But again, this is there are lots of differences between the cases, so I don't know. I don't know how best to draw out any lessons from that, except to say that extrajudicial killings are there are alternatives to those. Let's put it like that. But not everybody upholds that principle. And the second, if I understood you correctly, you were asking if China or in other states could be a counterbalance. Was that where you were getting at?
Similar to what you mentioned about the sister's question, which is power shifting from the United States, either financially or arms support, arms manufacturing, to perhaps a country which is a bit more either Muslim friendly or Asian friendly or
China's Muslim friendly.
Either a country which is more Muslim. You can't even talk about India that way. India is not Asian Muslim
India's
friendly. So you could probably say Brazil would be more Muslim friendly than the other countries, because then Lula went and condemned what happened in Israel. So I'm talking about a paradigm shift if there is any option available as such.
Yeah. I think that, again, we have a problem in the rules-based order being formed in this particular fashion. I think that it's important to find ways to strengthen international law to make that the basis of any rules-based order, however you want to term it. I will say, again, on the point of hypocrisy, the many call out the US for its hypocrisy, which is completely valid, and I think I did that repeatedly from the podium. They're often guilty of similar things themselves. So I think that we have to really place at the center of this international law and a respect for it and the fulfillment of it. I hope that answers your question. Madam Moderator.
Thank you very much, Professor Hellyer, for that sober and highly intellectual discussion on a very emotional issue, I would say, especially in the aftermath of the assassination of Mr. Ismail Haniyeh. So, ladies and gentlemen, that concludes our discussion on the topic today. And I now hand over the session to our MC. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Professor Ruhana Sarun, and our distinguished speaker, Dr. H.A. Hellyer, for leading us to a very productive and engaging session. Now, without further ado, I would like to invite Yang Berbahagia Professor Dr. Zarina Othman, President of the Malaysian International Studies Association, for a closing remarks. Please welcome Yang Berbahagia Professor Dr.
Distinguished guests, ladies and gentlemen, Assalamualaikum warahmatullahi wabarakatuh. Salam sejahtera and a very good evening. Thank you all for coming. This discussion is timely and the entire event has proceeded more quickly than anticipated. The ongoing war in Palestine, which began in Gaza on 7th October 2023, has drawn significant attention. As you can see, we face serious challenges ahead. The Palestinian community, driven from their homes, is under siege. The war in Gaza has caused extensive destruction. Although students of international relations have explored the causes of war and students of law have focused on rules and order, the war continues, highlighting the limitations of theoretical approaches. Despite the existence of international law, the conflict continues unabated. The damage inflicted can never be undone and is irreparable. As we speak right now, more lives are being lost. Unofficial reports indicate that more than 80% of hospitals has been destroyed, while those still standing suffer from power outages, staff shortages, and insufficient medications. Those who survive face severe human security issues, struggling with food scarcity and inaccessibility. Children are unable to attend school and numerous mosques and churches have been damaged. The survivors are in desperate conditions, suffering from a serious lack of medical supplies and access to basic necessities, including clean water. The catastrophe has forced many to become refugees, fleeing across Palestine borders in search of survival. These does not count for those who have become hostages or prisoners of war. Many of us will agree that this tragedy is not merely a matter of race or religion. It is at its core a profound humanitarian crisis that gravely impacts human rights and human security. Constant attention and ongoing action are urgently needed. We owe it to those who live in fear of persecution today. We owe it to the future of humanity. I would like to take this opportunity to acknowledge and express my gratitude to all those who have contributed to the success of this event. Our heartfelt thanks goes to University Kebangsaan Malaysia and the Institute of Malaysia and International Studies IKMAS for their unwavering support, the Malaysian International Studies Association, my ISA or my ISA, for their tireless effort in promoting international studies, and our major collaborators, Institute Masa Depan Malaysia, MASA, and the Center for Human Rights Research and Advocacy Central for their invaluable contributions and steadfast commitment to human rights and advocacy. Thank you to everyone involved, including Dr. Abdul Rahim, Dr. Atika Shafinas from KITA, our volunteer students who have sacrificed their semester break to ensure that the program runs smoothly. Without the collective efforts of these esteemed institutions and their dedicated teams, this event would not have been possible. Our heartfelt thanks goes to guest speaker, Dr. H.A. Hellyer, who has given us insightful views on the war in Palestine and its consequences. Special thanks to Professor Rohanas Harun, our moderator. We are grateful for your contributions and tireless effort toward this important event. It is my sincere hope that this event will raise awareness and foster a better understanding, serving as an eye-opener to the endless conflict in the Middle East. I also hope that this lecture will broaden our knowledge and inspire us to continuously contribute to the discourse on contemporary issues facing our world today. Let us continue to be the avenue that provides the best and most conducive learning environment for our students, our future leaders, and fosters the exchange of ideas. Thank you all for joining us. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Yang Berbahagia Professor Dr. Zarina Othman. As a symbol of memento from the organizer, I would like to invite Yang Berbahagia Professor Dr. Sufyan Jusso, Yang Berbahagia Professor Dr. Zarina Othman, and Mr. Azrul Muhammad Amin to the stage to present a token of heartfelt appreciation.
Just here. Yeah. Oh, that's
First, I'd like to invite Yang Berbahagia Professor Dr. Sufyan Jusso to present a token of appreciation to our honorable speaker, Dr. H.A. Hellyer. Please welcome. Next, I would like to invite Mr. Azrul Muhammad Amin to present a token of appreciation to our honorable moderator, Professor Rohanas Harun. Next, I would like to invite Professor Dr. Zarina Othman to present a token of appreciation to Yang Berbahagia Professor Dr. Sufyan Jusso. Please welcome. Yang Berbahagia Datuk, Professor Dr. Ladies and gentlemen, let us give a round of applause to Dr. Hisham Hellyer and Professor Rohanas Harun. Next on the agenda, I would like to invite our distinguished speaker and VIP guest on the center of stage for a photo session. Thank you. Please be seated. Every beginning has an end. Yang berbahagia Datuk, Professor, Doctor, ladies and gentlemen, as we draw to a close on this special lecture event, I would like to share a good quote by Dr. Hellyer, who once said, "Focus your energies on getting true and accurate insights out there. Do good, be kind, and stay true. Let us all be guided by all the things we have learned and heard throughout the conference and be able to see and influence our future." We thank you again for joining us on this special lecture event, and we wish you all the best of luck in your future endeavors. See you in the next lecture. Last but not least, our distinguished speaker, VIP guests, and participants are invited for a refreshment at the banquet room at level 2. I'm Nur Melinda Lee, signing off as your MC for today with Wabillahi Taufiq wal Hidayah. Wassalamualaikum warahmatullahi wabarakatuh. Thank you. Our distinguished speakers, VIP guests are invited for a refreshment at level 2 banquet. Thank you.
Yeah.